All right. Now, the ancient people are very religious people. And the religion that they believed in Mesopotamia, people do not believe in today. So it's going to sound very different to us. In the center of each city in Sumer was a temple called a ziggurat. Now, this is a picture of a drawing of what that ziggurat looked like in ancient times. So you can see, pretty elaborate structure. So the ziggurat was made up of a series of square levels. So we could see the square levels here, square, square, square. Each level is smaller than the one below it. So like you starting here, you have this big one, and then smaller, smaller, and then smaller. Huge stairways went up to the top of the ziggurat. So there you see that going up to the top. And the Mesopotamians believed the most powerful god lived at the top of the ziggurat. Now, let me just explain a little bit about their religious beliefs. They believed in many different gods and goddesses. They believed that each thing in nature, there was a god or goddess in charge of it. For example, the sun god in Mesopotamia was named Shamash. So they believed, and they believed Shamash, like they could see Shamash. Like they looked in the, like if someone ever was like, I don't think Shamash is real, they'd be like, what are you talking about? You feel that heat? That's Shamash warming us. So it would be very hard to convince the Mesopotamians otherwise. So what would happen is this. Only priests were allowed to leave offerings at the top of the ziggurat. Now, here's a little insight into their beliefs, because some of the things that they believed are because they didn't know what we know based on science. And I'll give you an example. So they believed that the gods and goddesses needed to get food and drink from priests, just like humans need food and drink to survive. Well, here's what would happen. The priest would bring, let's say, like a cup of water here, and then they leave. And after a day, they'd come back, and the cup of water would have evaporated, meaning like the water's gone because it's been sitting in the heat the whole time. It evaporated. But the Mesopotamians don't know about the science of evaporation, so they would think, oh my gosh, the gods drank this. Around the ziggurats are the center of Sumerian life. So this ziggurat temple is in the center of the city. It was the location of many jobs, schools, celebration, and storage. It's where a lot of people went for different things. Oh, and before I go on, I want to show you what it looks like today, because in Iraq today, there are still some ziggurats. So the biggest, most famous ziggurat was in that main city we called Ur. And here's what it looks like today. So if you went to Iraq today, you can see the ziggurat right here. So obviously, you might be wondering like where the rest of it is, because if we look at our picture here, you're only looking at like this level, like this top stuff is gone. And the reason why it's gone is the ziggurat was sitting in the desert for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So over time, sandstorms destroyed it. So the sandstorms just constantly pelting the ziggurat over time would destroy it. And here's another view of the ziggurat. If you went to Iraq today, this is what you would see. All right. Moving on. Here we go. So the Sumerians believed that all the forces of nature were alive, like the winds, the rain, all that kind of stuff. And since they couldn't control these forces, they viewed them as gods. And in total, they believed that there were more than 3,000 Sumerian gods and goddesses. And as I mentioned, they are an extremely religious people. They believed that their role on earth is to serve the gods. They believed that humans were made by the gods from the mud of the river to serve them. Now, again, I need to emphasize this is not a type of religion people practice today. So if you're hearing me say this and you're like, but we don't believe in this, well, yes, because it's thousands of years later. These people lived before all the major religions that exist today were a thing. The Sumerians thought their only reason for living was to serve the gods, as we mentioned. They worried that if the gods weren't happy with them, their crops wouldn't grow. They believed that priests had a special connection to the gods. And so the priests were kind of like the messenger of the gods. All of the land of the city is controlled by the gods in Mesopotamian law, but the priests are like the managers of the land for the gods. The priests are the ones also in charge of the schools. Now, speaking of schools, so messed up. Schools are only for sons of the rich. So in Mesopotamia, if you were a female, you're not allowed to go to school. And let me just get that out there right now. All of the ancient people, in terms of human rights, in terms of civil rights, in terms of equality, are terrible when it comes to those things. They considered women and men not to be equal. They treat slaves like they're property and not people. So, sometimes I get this question, being a teacher of ancient history, I get the question of, would you ever want to go there and see how it was? No, they're horrible to women and slaves. There's the fact that there is slaves and all that kind of stuff. No, I would not want to go there. Now, if you were a boy and you were not wealthy, if you were poor, you learned how to farm. Schools were called tablet houses in Mesopotamia. And I know when we think tablet, we think like iPads. But no, this is like, let's see if I can show you a picture. Like this kind, oh, nope, wrong one. Like this, that you see here that I'm going to talk about in a couple minutes. Like this is a tablet, like a piece of stone. Now, students sat in rows on brick benches. The whole point of school was to teach people how to write. And what they did is they wrote with sharp-ended reeds on clay tablets, which are small, like the size of a postcard. And the first type of writing is something called cuneiform. And it's made out of hundreds of markings that look like wedges. So let me show you. Let's see if we can zoom in a bit. Oh, no, I'm not commenting on this. Zooming in. Let me try this again. Take two, zooming in. As you can tell, when I make mistakes on this video, I don't edit it. You get to see the mistakes as they're happening because I feel like that makes it more fun. All right. So if I zoom in, I just had it. And then I blew it. There we go. You can see these little kind of wedge shapes. So these would stand for like whole words and different things. Next. So the whole reason writing becomes a thing is because people had to keep track of their business deals. I talked about surplus. So when you have extra, you trade it for someone that doesn't have what you need and possibly get something you don't have. So if you're a merchant and you're trading things, you need a system to keep track of what's selling. And that's where writing develops. It was made to keep records. And because there's cities, there are a lot more people, so it's harder to remember what goods sold well on what day. So at first, the Sumerians would draw whole pictures to represent the objects, but that got way too time-consuming. So they later switched to the symbol system called cuneiform. Now, When you graduated from school, you became a scribe, which is a Mesopotamian writer. And that word scribe is in so many words today. For example, when you sign your name, that's writing in script. When you're writing with a lot of detail, you're describing. When a doctor is giving medicine, they're prescribing. I could do this all day. So, scribe is connected to a lot of words today that have to do with writing. So, if you were a scribe, you could get a bunch of different jobs. You could get hired to work for the temple to write down different prayers for things. You could work for the palace and work for the king. You could work for the government officials who work for the king. You could work for the army. You could work for a merchant, or you could be hired as just a writer for the public. And anytime somebody needed something written down, they would pay you and you'd write it down. As I mentioned before, women were not allowed to go to school, and they don't have a lot of rights in Mesopotamia. Again, so messed up. Now, in Mesopotamia, a woman could buy or sell property, they could run a business, they could own or sell slaves. And again, the fact that Mesopotamia has slavery is another reason this is not a place I would ever want to go to with different things. They also were in charge of things if their husband was away. And the husband is considered the head of the household. Now, just to give you an insight as to how it was in Mesopotamia, where the men had more rights than women. Well, first of all, let me say this. Men and women in ancient times did not get married for love. They got married as part of business deals. So the way it would work is your parents and another person's parents would make a deal and you had to marry that person. You had no say of it. So let's say the husband and wife get married. The wife doesn't get the same rights as the husband. In fact, if the marriage isn't working out, all the husband had to do is say to his wife, "You are not my wife," and now they're divorced. If a woman wanted to leave her husband in Mesopotamia, she couldn't. She was stuck in that marriage. In Mesopotamia, only the men could decide when the marriage was over. So messed up. Another so messed up situation here. If a husband needed money, he could sell or rent his wife and kids as slaves for up to 3 years. So messed up. As I mentioned, he also gets to pick who his kids marry. This next thing, not so messed up. Children are expected to support their parents when their parents became older, the same way that your parents do things, I'm sure, for older relatives like grandparents. So that is a good thing in Mesopotamia. All right, so moving on to the next thing in terms of who's in charge of these places. So the leader of a Sumerian city is called a priest king. So they're like part priest, part king. So that's why they're called priest king. And the most famous priest king is this guy called Gilgamesh. I know, funny name, Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is from a Mesopotamian city called Uruk, not Ur. I'll show you where Uruk is. So here's Ur, here's Uruk. So they're neighbors, not far. Now, he is so famous and so beloved in Uruk, they start to make up adventure stories starring him. So the stories make Gilgamesh seem like he has superpowers. So these stories didn't really happen. It's like taking like a celebrity and putting them in a comic book like they have superpowers when they actually obviously don't. So Gilgamesh is so beloved, he has his own adventure stories written about him. Now, this is pretty cool. The story of Gilgamesh is written in the year 1700 BCE, so we're talking over 3,700 years ago. It is the oldest story that has ever been found in the entire world. Yeah, because this predates all the major religions. And the story of Gilgamesh was found on a Mesopotamian tablet. Here it is right there. There's many more tablets of the story of Gilgamesh. And in the story of Gilgamesh, he has a sidekick, like all good superheroes do. There's Batman and Robin, and so on and so on. Gilgamesh and his sidekick, Enkidu. And they travel all over the world performing acts of courage. So, what I'm going to do, there are many different chapters to the Gilgamesh story. Right now, I'm going to read one of these adventures. So, this has been translated into English from ancient cuneiform, and it's one of the adventures of Gilgamesh and his sidekick Enkidu. So, you ready? Here we go. All right. Once upon a time, a powerful king called Gilgamesh ruled the city of Uruk. Uruk was a busy city on the flat Mesopotamian plain near the banks of the Euphrates River. Wait for it. There it goes. King Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu soon became bored with everyday life in Uruk. They wanted to see the world and find adventure. Gilgamesh suggested they journey across the flat plains to the distant mountains. They could bring back some wood from the cedar forests. Cedar wood was special for many reasons. Cedar trees grew very tall and straight. Long timbers could be used for roof beams and doors in temples and palaces. And where they're talking about in ancient times is this. So over here in what is today the country of Lebanon, cedar trees are a big part of the history of Lebanon. So they're over here in Uruk. So they're talking about going on an adventure to what is today Lebanon. In fact, cedar trees are so important. My internet's come on, internet. Come on. Come on. Come on. Look what's on the flag of Lebanon. Waiting for a picture. Here it comes. It's a cedar tree. See, such an important of Lebanon's history. Anyway, there's a little side note. Back to the story. So, the wood is also good for building because it lasted many, many years without decaying. The rich smell of the cedar wood in the palaces and temples is a nice, pleasant smell. So that's why they're like, let's go get some. Everyone in Uruk heard stories of a demon called Humbaba, who guarded the cedar forest in faraway hills. Humbaba's roar was like the sound of a flood, his mouth was like fire, and his breath was like death. Yikes. However, Gilgamesh and Enkidu were excited by the thought of meeting Humbaba. They were both very strong and believed they could defeat him in battle. The journey would certainly provide the adventure they were looking for. Gilgamesh and Enkidu set out for the cedar forest with enough supplies to last them for several weeks and weapons to use against Humbaba. They left the city of Uruk and began the journey across the flat plain which stretched out from the banks of the river. The two friends traveled very fast. Normally the journey would take 6 months, but Gilgamesh and Enkidu took just 15 days. Why? Because this is not a true story. It's like a superhero story from ancient times. They arrived at the mountain and gazed at the wonderful sight. The forest covered the mountain and the cedar trees grew straight and tall. Gilgamesh and Enkidu stopped for the night and made an offering to the sun god Shamash. The next morning, they entered the forest. They did not meet Humbaba straight away. They climbed the mountain until they reached the peaks where the air was crisp. Finally, they came to the place where the best cedars in the forest grew. They put down their supplies, chose the tallest trees, and prepared to cut them down. They had only just touched their axes to the trees when they heard a terrible noise. They both froze where they stood. Gilgamesh and Enkidu guessed that the sound was the demon Humbaba, and there's his creepy eyes. Suddenly, the demon stood before them. He had teeth like a dragon, a face like a lion, and glaring eyes. In a booming voice, Humbaba demanded to know why they had entered his forest. Humbaba threatened to destroy the two friends if they did not leave immediately. He twisted his ugly face into a terrifying grimace. Gilgamesh was frightened, but he and Enkidu decided to stay and fight. They summoned the 13 great winds with the help of the sun god Shamash. The winds were very powerful. They were the north wind, south wind, east wind, west wind, icy wind, whirlwind, scorching wind, hurricane, gale, devil wind, blasting wind, storm wind, and typhoon. Whew. The great winds trapped Humbaba, and he pleaded with Gilgamesh to set him free, promising to give him as much timber as he could carry. Timber means wood. That's why, side note, when you chop down a tree, you know how people are like, timber! Really, they're just shouting, wood! Anyway, but Gilgamesh and Enkidu did not believe him, and with one sword stroke, Gilgamesh cut off the demon's head. Yeah. So, Gilgamesh and Enkidu cut down many trees and chopped them into logs. They lashed the wood together and carried it from the forest. At the river, they made a raft, loaded the logs onto it, and set off downstream to Uruk. After many days, they reached the city. The people held celebrations to welcome home King Gilgamesh and Enkidu and listened to their tales of great adventures, and they brought a little trophy home. This is disturbing. I see the head of Humbaba as their trophy. Yikes. So that's just one chapter of the Gilgamesh kind of adventures. All right. Sumerian priest kings get advice from advisors. There's people that advise the leaders. In times of war, it would be a military leader that takes the kingship. So essentially, sometimes people wonder, like, how did the first king begin? Well, essentially, it works like this. The strongest person militarily becomes the leader, and they become the king. And then military leaders then pass on the right to be king to their sons, and then it gets passed on to their sons. Unfortunately, again, so messed up. Not the girls, just the boys. So messed up. And when something is passed down from parent to child, it is called hereditary. So, that is the first part of your Mesopotamia notes. To awkwardly watch me stop. It's always awkward stopping the video.